All right, what is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the one and only Wrestling Otaku channel. Of course, your personification of excellence on YouTube and YWC. We're the best reviews wrestling and your three-time YWC channel of the year. And I'm back here. It is now officially Thursday, July 17th of 2025. So hope you all having a good one. Got off work earlier, just kind of relaxing, chilling out here. And I decided to go ahead and give you guys another video here because this is a video today that I'll be bringing you that I've been wanting to do for quite some time, and I figured now would be as good a time as any while it's fresh on my mind and everything. And again, I've been waiting to talk about this, been meaning to talk about this for a while. I even made a post about it about a week or two ago, and so I figured I'd go ahead and give it to you here. So apologies if my voice isn't the best, and I may need to periodically pause the video because I am kind of coming down with a little bit of something, I've been sneezing and coughing up mucus, what have you, a little bit of a sore throat, I had it as early as last night, I was having symptoms, so all this weather is, really kind of getting to me. I figured it was only a matter of time with all the change in, the weather and, freaking as hot as it's been, so in the 90s and so on and so forth with the heat and humidity, and then you got storms and stuff, and then I have to be out in that, on my to and from work and stuff. I knew it was going to get to me eventually, and sure enough, here I am. It isn't like too severe right now. I did take some medicine. Hopefully, I took some medicine, took a nap. Hopefully, it doesn't get any worse than it is. But I want to go ahead while I'm still in the mood to, and I'm still able to, go ahead and do this video for you guys. So, with that being said, let's get into it here. So, there's been a lot of discussion in regards to WWE this year and the decline in the interest of WWE. And if you don't think that there is a decline in interest in WWE, then quite frankly, you're fooling yourself. Look at the attendance numbers. You look at the ratings for any of their shows. Raw on Netflix was supposed to be a big deal. They got that big deal. That big TV streaming deal with Netflix. 10 years. Billions of dollars and all that. And then the debut at the beginning of the year, and now you see what their numbers are for Netflix, and it's far below what was expected or what was anticipated in terms of like a global audience. And you look at the numbers for SmackDown, they hit an all-time low. I think like a week or two ago, they had like 1.1 million, like an all-time low on USA. NXT struggling in terms of like their viewership on CW since they moved over to CW. They expected a big jump and they haven't really gotten it. It's pretty much the same numbers that they're getting on USA. And the ticket sales are in the decline, even for big shows like WrestleMania. They couldn't sell out WrestleMania both nights. I talked about the three shows they did over the weekend, the same weekend that they tried to counter program AEW. All three of them, they had no sellouts in any of those three shows. In fact, All In outsold all of them in terms of total attendance. AEW's All In Texas had a higher attendance than all three of WWE shows over the weekend. And so there is a very clear and distinct decline in terms of WWE, in terms of the interest in WWE, and in terms of just everything you want to, wrestling fans, I use that term loosely, wrestling fans seem to like to bring up things like metrics and numbers and ratings and all that kind of stuff and pay attention to that stuff, even though realistically it's not that big of a deal. Like, you look at fans of any other sport, they don't do this. Only wrestling fans really do this, but they like to bring up the numbers and the metrics, and you can't argue, you can't dispute, you can't deny that there's a lack of interest and a decline in interest in WWE right now. And the big discussion is who is to blame for this decline in terms of the interest and in terms of like what they're doing creatively on TV. Like, there's obviously a clear lack of interest, or there's a clear pattern of WWE not booking their shows as well as they have in previous years. And there's been a lot of discussion. Now, the one name that comes to mind that everybody wants to talk about, of course, that comes to front and center in terms of the blame and what has seemed to be the focal point in these discussions is Triple H, Paul Levesque, who of course is a big part of WWE right now and has been for years. He's the CCO, the Chief Content Officer. He's part of the WWE Board of Directors, in terms of TKO on the WWE side. He's the head of creative. He's the head booker. You know, his name is constantly brought up. Like when they have the closing credits for the shows for WWE, he's right there, like the first name you see in the closing credits, Paul Levesque. So his name, his DNA, his fingerprints are on everything in terms of what WWE does creatively, and has been since, you know, let's say since 2022, 2023, when Vince got ousted from the company, and they got acquired by TKO, by Endeavor. And so a lot of people have been saying that Triple H, you know, should take the blame, should take, you know, the full brunt of the blame for WWE's decline of interest in terms of in terms of the shows, in terms of what they're doing creatively. And there was even a report, I want to say like a month or two ago, I say back in like May or the beginning of June, where WWE or TKO, you know, WWE's parent company who owns them, or Endeavor, whatever have you, Endeavor, TKO, was contemplating releasing or basically cutting ties with Triple H, or removing Triple H from as head of creative, or removing him from WWE altogether if things don't improve. There was this story, and I'm sure a lot of you know what I'm talking about. You know, I'm sure a number of you have heard of this story, or at least read about or know about this story, where TKO was basically contemplating removing Triple H as early as within the next year and a half, 18 months, if things don't improve. And so that begs the question, is Triple H the reason for the decline? Is he the biggest reason why WWE's had a lack of interest within the last, I'd say, year? Really for the majority of 2025, you could argue. Is Triple H to blame for the decline at WWE? Obviously, there's a lot of this question brings up a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, whatever have you, and this is something that I thought about quite a bit. And you know, and I've seen the online, you know, discussion, banter, whatever have you within the IWC, and I want to share my opinion. Okay, kind of give my take on it. So, do I believe that Triple H is to blame for the lack of interest and the decline in WWE? I'm gonna say yes and no. Okay. I know that answer might surprise some of you. Maybe it won't, you know, depending on, you know, who you ask, I guess. But here's kind of my take on it, all right? I say yes and no, all right? I'm going to kind of play devil's advocate a little bit here. Just hear me out, okay? First, let's go with no. I say no because you have to remember, WWE is a corporately owned company now. You know, they're not privately owned anymore. Well, they recently moved back to being a quote-unquote private company, but they're still owned by a corporate entity. They're still owned by TKO. They're still owned by Endeavor. So yeah, they're still very much in the public view or in the public eye. They're still a publicly traded company and all that kind of stuff. You know, the stocks and the shareholders, and they've been that way for a long time, ever since Vince owned them. You know, since the 2000s. You know, since 2000, since '99, when Vince moved the company, you know, turned it into a publicly traded company, and then, you know, they started selling stock on the stock market and all that kind of stuff. And they've been a corporate company, you know, they've been corporately minded for the longest time. And even more so now that they're part of TKO, even more so now that they got acquired by Endeavor a couple years ago. And obviously, as a result of that, the philosophy within the company excuse me again, you have to bear with me. Again, I'm still dealing with a bit of a cold, you know, summer cold, so I did say that at the beginning of the video. But WWE is a corporately owned company, and everything that they do internally, or at the very least in terms of the major business decisions and where they go forward, goes through their head company, goes through their parent company. Everything that they do is decided by their parent company, TKO, which is obviously fronted by Ari Emanuel, all right? And they're part of WWE, is a part of TKO, which includes obviously UFC. They're, again, Endeavor already owned UFC, and then they acquired WWE, and then they had that merger, which basically, you know, resulted in them being rebranded as TKO. There's a pecking order within WWE. There's a clear and distinct pecking order in terms of their business decisions and in terms of what they do overall as a whole, as a company, and what they focus on as a company. And if you think about the pecking order, Triple H, while he is up there, he is a focal point. He is a major figure, a major player in terms of WWE decisions. He is not the head of everything. He does not make all the decisions. In fact, he actually answers to other people, right? When you think about the pecking order in TKO, it's obviously Ari Emanuel, who is in charge, who is the head of everything in terms of TKO Endeavor. Then you could argue The Rock, who, because The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, is part of the TKO board of directors. Not necessarily the WWE board of directors per se. He's on the TKO board of directors. So he's got significant stroke in everything that they do. So it's Ari Emanuel, then it's The Rock. Then if you want to look at WWE, you could say Nick Khan, I believe, is number 3. And then after him is Triple H. So if we're talking pecking order and in terms of power, in terms of like who says what, who has the biggest influence in the promotion, you could argue Triple H is like number 4 on the list in terms of like power, in terms of in terms of influence and what they do internally and what they do as a company. So he is not, again, Triple H, I believe, answers to other people. He does not own WWE outright. Okay, this isn't a situation where, like, when the McMahon family owned WWE as a whole. Vince McMahon had final say on everything. Vince McMahon made all the decisions, whether it be creatively, whether it be from a wrestling standpoint, business standpoint, it didn't matter. Vince owned everything. He had say over anything. He could do anything he wanted because he owned the company outright. He had majority share in terms of the stock. He owned like 80% of the stock when he was in charge of WWE, when he did own it. It was a McMahon family business. And then a couple years ago, they sold to Endeavor, and he got ousted from the company. And it's, the rest is history. And so with Triple H, he is a byproduct of WWE being sold. He's not, he is, again, he has influence, but he is not the man in charge. He does not make all the decisions. I personally think in terms of internally in TKO, there's a side that makes decisions for UFC. There's a UFC board of directors, and then there's a WWE board of directors. Triple H is obviously, like, in terms of that board of directors, is like top 2 or 3. But he's not the guy who makes all the decisions. He's not. So you have to keep that in mind. And if you remember, early this year, going into WrestleMania, there was word internally of a power struggle, you could say, between Triple H, Paul Levesque, and The Rock, that being Dwayne Johnson, because Dwayne Johnson, or The Rock, he had this storyline that he wanted to go with, where basically, and again, this is all reports, I'm just going off of what I'm hearing, we don't know truly what all happened, so I can only go by what I hear. I can only go by what's being reported. But the reports say The Rock wanted to have a significant role in terms of the storyline when it comes to Cody Rhodes. He wanted Cody Rhodes to turn heel. That was the story. Cody Rhodes apparently didn't want to turn heel. And there's a number of other people within WWE who thought Cody Rhodes turning heel wasn't exactly the best move. Apparently Triple H was one of those people. So as a result, instead of Cody Rhodes turning heel, ultimately they had John Cena turning heel. And there was a number of other things going into that. Apparently Cena wasn't supposed to turn heel until WrestleMania, but they ended up, moving it forward to Elimination Chamber and so on and so forth because The Rock apparently wasn't quote unquote scheduled, or wasn't, he wasn't booked, or he had no plans of appearing at WrestleMania at all. And it kind of resulted in just this weird instance of circumstances surrounding the John Cena heel turn, where The Rock was, you could argue, essentially the reason why Cena turned heel in the first place. And then afterwards, he had no instance in So if you think about that whole fiasco, going into this year's WrestleMania, where The Rock was basically responsible, you could say, for John Cena's heel turn, and then after the fact, him just vanishing from TV, vanishing from the storyline entirely, and going into WrestleMania, he didn't even make an appearance in that main event match with Cena and Cody Rhodes. And going forward, we haven't really seen him since. And then he came out in an interview or two, and he basically stated, well, I helped them along or whatever, and going forward, it's on them to continue to further the storyline, or something to that effect. And it's like, this guy was responsible for Cena turning heel in the first place, and then they don't follow up on it. He doesn't even follow up on it. He doesn't have any sort of, you know, again, kayfabe wise, in terms of like TV, in terms of what they were doing, he doesn't even come out and explain, what his whole deal was, what his whole plan was or ploy was, or why John Cena aligned with him. He couldn't even bother to do like a pre-recorded segment or do a via satellite interview or anything like that and explain, the whole situation with why he chose Cena and why Cena turned heel in the first place. It didn't make sense. And I think that whole thing is the biggest reason, one of the biggest reasons why the WrestleMania main event was as big of a flop as it was, and why creative going into Mania and now after Mania has been as big of a flop. I think that whole situation threw a major wrench, a major monkey wrench into plans, creatively when it comes to, WrestleMania. And I do think that the after effect has translated into what we're seeing now. And so as a result, and getting back to my point, while Triple H, again, he runs everything creatively, I do believe that there are people within TKO and within the company who can essentially usurp his authority. If they want to involve themselves in something creatively, they have full reign to do so. The Rock is the biggest example of that. Everything, obviously, The Rock, he's Dwayne Johnson. As I mentioned before, he's part of TKO Board of Directors. He can do whatever he wants. He can do whatever he wants, and Triple H cannot stop him. If he wants to do something, like in terms of like his character on TV, he obviously has full control of his own creative. He obviously has full, I'm sure he, to an extent, has free reign as to what he wants to do storyline-wise, in terms of like if he wants to wrestle a match, in terms of plans going into WrestleMania. I'm sure he has full reign on whatever it is he wants to do. And that can alter plans going forward, like in terms of what Triple H or whoever, runs creative, whoever else runs creative, I should say, does going forward. So that's kind of my point. Triple H is not the be-all, end-all like Vince McMahon was. He answers to other people. And if you think about what WWE is becoming right now, and the fans are starting to see the writing on the wall. You see them becoming very corporately minded, very, very much based on, they're obviously very centered on profits, on their sponsors and the shareholders and all that kind of shit. They were that way when Vince was running too, but now you see it even more so. You see all the ads being incorporated into the show. Even during the show, you see ads. Whenever you tune into a WWE show, you see ads all around the fucking ring, ads on the apron, ads on the Titantron, on the announce tables, hell, even on the weapons. It's gotten to the point where they got sponsors, fucking logos and ads on the fucking weapons. Like, I remember watching a match, I forget which one it was, where, again, I forget what match it was, but they were doing like a table spot, and the fucking tables had fucking logos on them. The tables had fucking the Slim Jim logo on either side. It's like, are you kidding me? And then you got a million fucking ad breaks during the shows, whether it be, I'm sure it's on Raw, I don't know, because I haven't really watched Raw on Netflix or whatever, on SmackDown, Saturday night's main event, NXT to a degree, but there's like a million fucking ad breaks. And it's obvious what they're doing. It's obvious WWE's becoming very corporately minded, very much money driven, profit driven, and fans see the writing on the wall, and that's kind of what WWE is slowly, gradually turning into. It's becoming less about wrestling, it's becoming less about the content itself and the quality of the content, and, wanting to give the fans what they want to see in terms of a wrestling show. It's becoming less about that and becoming more about appeasing the sponsors and the shareholders and making a profit in the best way they can, or making the most money they can, or turn their profit in any way they can. That's why they still do business with a fucking government, with a fucking place like Saudi Arabia. I mean, come on, but yeah. So in that sense, just kind of getting back to my main point here, because I don't want to go on too long, because I'm already almost 20 minutes in. I haven't got to the other half yet. But in that sense, I do not believe that Triple H is entirely to blame with everything that WWE is doing, and just the lack of interest, or just the decline in interest in terms of what they do on their shows, and in terms of what they do in the company. There's a lack of interest in WWE in general, and I do think that just what they're doing on a regular basis, corporate-wise, they're becoming very corporately driven, And Triple H really doesn't have, like, I'm sure he co-signs on certain things, but he does not have the final say on stuff like that, I don't believe. So in that sense, I don't believe Triple H is ultimately fully to blame for the decline. Now, let me get to the other side of that. Because with everything that I just said, put that to the side. I do believe that Triple H has some blame with the decline in the interest of WWE. And so let me get to the yes answer to my question. So I do believe that Triple H has some involvement with the decline in WWE. And for the reason being, obviously, he is head of creative. He is the chief content officer, the CEO. He has full reign in terms of what they do on TV, in terms of what they do on pay-per-views, in terms of the matches they book, in terms of the storylines, in terms of the characters, the gimmicks, in terms of anything creatively. Everything runs through him. Everything runs through him. And as I mentioned before, when it comes to the TV shows, when it comes to the production, everything has his fingerprints on it. It's his fingerprints, it's his DNA, everything. When they have the closing credit, like I mentioned before, they have the closing credits for a show like SmackDown or Raw or NXT, you see his name pop up. The first name that pops up, Paul Levesque. His name is on everything. His fingerprints are on everything. And so, you look at what WWE is doing creatively, and you could argue, again, when it comes to the WrestleMania thing, when it comes to the Rock thing, the John Cena turning heel, why that's been such a flop. You could say that, it was a bit of a power struggle between him and The Rock, but ultimately, it's up to him to kind of going forward after WrestleMania, and we didn't see The Rock since. After WrestleMania, and the follow-up to the John Cena stuff, and the follow-up to everything else, that falls on him. That falls on Triple H. It falls on him creatively. And, I think people are so used to, the whole mystique and the whole, I want to say illusion, the whole image of Triple H being responsible for the success of NXT, like the original NXT. Like after, I'm not talking about the original NXT where it was like basically like a reality-based competition or whatever, where guys were trying to become a wrestler or whatever. I'm talking about the NXT from like 2014, 2015 that aired on WWE Network. And, it was basically their version of a super indie, and Triple H, had full reign over the whole thing. And it was and seeing what NXT, how popular NXT within the confines of WWE, how popular they became. And I think fans really gravitated to it because it was in stark contrast to what they were doing on the main roster, which at the time was run by Vince, was led by Vince. Everything they did on the main roster was the complete opposite of what they did on NXT. And I think that's why people gravitated to what they did on NXT, the original NXT. That aired on WWE Network from 2015, 2016, 2017. People consider that the glory days, if you will, of NXT. And Triple H obviously was a big part of that, a big part of the success of the original NXT and everything that they did. And again, I think that was basically his way of showing people that, hey, I can run a show, I can, again, it was his version, basically. It was his version of a super indie. And he, I think, with the things that he did, with the things that he allowed on that show, basically kind of showcased, what fans really kind of what they wanted to see in regards to a show, on the main roster. It's just that Vince McMahon, who was running things at the time, who owned the entire company at the time, it's like, let's face facts. Vince McMahon was incredibly out of touch. He was incredibly out of touch. He didn't know what the hell he was doing. Even, during those times. You could argue as far back as the 2000s, Vince ultimately didn't know what the fuck he was doing. And he should have named a successor to himself, but he didn't. And what happened. And, again, rest is history. He ended up selling. He got ousted for the whole sexual misconduct thing, the Janelle Grant stuff, all the other stuff that we found out about later, the Wall Street Journal reports, all the things we found out. And then, again, the rest is history. But yeah, Triple H was essentially the catalyst for NXT becoming as big as it became, even within the confines of just being quote-unquote developmental. A lot of people considered NXT to be better than the main roster. They consider the shows they put on NXT being better than shows that they put on for Raw and SmackDown and the main scene pay-per-views. It's like, and Triple H was a part of that. And so I think people have this kind of image of Triple H where, oh, that was his baby, that was his creation, and so he's such a, as a result of that, he's a genius booker and so on and so forth, and he's capable of booking things to that degree. Why can't he do the same thing for the main roster? And ultimately, he's got the chance to. When again, Vince McMahon was ousted, WWE was acquired by Endeavor, formed TKO. Triple H was made in charge of creative. Vince McMahon, again, no longer in the picture. Triple H had full reign creatively. And people said, at the time, people believed that, oh, Triple H is in charge of creative. He's going to take what he did in NXT. He's going to take what made NXT successful, and he's going to incorporate it into the main roster. And for a while, he did. And in the first year or so, you could argue, a lot of the things you saw them do, you could see the differences in how Triple H ran the show's main roster versus how Vince or Bruce Pritchard or whoever was in charge back then ran things on the main roster. And for a while that did work. But over time, and especially you're seeing it this year, things haven't quite been as interesting or as appealing as maybe you would think when it comes to a Triple H-led WWE, when it comes to a Triple H creatively led WWE. And honestly, again, he's to blame for that. Now, could it be a situation where he was, plans change, wrestlers leave, wrestlers come, so on and so forth. They got guys leaving, guys getting cut, guys coming back, various different things, guys getting hurt, guys getting injured, taken out of plans, so on and so forth. And then again, there's, stuff like the power struggle I mentioned before with The Rock and all that kind of stuff and everything else. You could argue that's a part of it too, but ultimately, it's Triple H's job to make everything from a wrestling standpoint, everything from a creative standpoint, and what they do on TV. It's his job to make everything as appealing as possible to the fan base. And for the majority of this year, hasn't really done that. I mean, let's just be real. Now, you could say it's a matter of him, maybe certain guys, maybe certain talents haven't quite been as good as maybe he expected them to be. Maybe, certain things didn't play out the way that, they wanted to creatively. Maybe, certain guys weren't as appealing to the crowd as maybe they were before. The wrestling fan base is very fickle. People change, people turn on people the snap of the finger. I mean, you all should know how the wrestling fan base is. I mean, that's just how the IWC is. People, one minute people are really high on somebody, and then the next minute they fucking turn on them. I mean, look at Jey Uso, for example. Jey Uso is a perfect example. But it could be a situation of maybe he's running out of ideas. Maybe he just doesn't have it. Maybe the creative flow, or his creative, maybe his creativity isn't quite as big or as good as it was, say, prior when he was in charge of NXT, or in his first year running running the entirety of WWE creative. Maybe he's just running short on ideas. Maybe he's got, I don't know, writer's block. I don't know, any one of those things. I think that would be a fair assessment, without taking necessarily shots or jabs. Maybe he's just run out of ideas. Maybe the guys who he wanted to push as the next guys, maybe they haven't panned out as planned. You look at Cody Rhodes, for example. They're pushing Cody Rhodes to be the next face of the company, and now you're kind of starting to see a little bit of the backlash where fans are kind of starting to have mixed reactions to him. It's kind of that, excuse me, it's kind of that John Cena Roman Reigns effect, where you book a guy, you build a guy up to be the top guy, and everybody kind of sees the writing on the wall, what you're doing, and then they kind of turn on him. It's like the John Cena effect. It's the Roman Reigns effect. And it's kind of happening with Cody Rhodes, which is ironic because it happened with Cody Rhodes in AEW right before he left, and now it's happening in WWE. I just find that very funny, very ironic, but that's another story. That's another topic. But yeah, I just think that ultimately, regardless of, everything, everything that WWE is and what they've become, what their mentality is and what, clearly their focus is in terms of business and the business side. Everything on the creative and the wrestling side falls on Triple H. Everything from a TV show standpoint, from a pay-per-view standpoint, from an interest, the gimmicks, the matches, like I said, the storylines, everything falls on him. Like, I'm sure he has writers. I'm sure there are writers, there are other people who, have creative, or, I'm sure, again, he has a team of creative writers and all that kind of stuff. As you remember, there have been reports, of WWE having many different writers or whatever, at least when Vince was there. I'm not sure what it is now. I'm sure it's the same, they have like a team of 30 or 40 writers or people who write creative for them. And most of the people who write the stuff for them aren't even fucking wrestling fans, or, they're not wrestling writers. They're fucking TV show or, Hollywood writers. And, everything else. I'm sure, he has a team of, people who come up with things creatively. But Triple H has the final say, obviously, as the head of creative, as the head booker, as the chief content officer. He has final say on everything they do creatively, much like Vince did when he was in charge. So, again, if there's a lack of interest in terms of what they're doing creatively, in terms of, certain guys not getting over like they should, in terms of gimmicks, in terms of what they do, like the inconsistencies with their storylines, the inconsistencies with things that we see on TV, if that is an issue, and fans just aren't connecting with, with what they're doing like they were, in the previous year or so, it ultimately falls on him. It ultimately falls on Triple H. It ultimately falls on Paul Levesque. If there's a decline, it's up to him to kind of reel that in, steer that in, and make changes, and apply those changes and try to make the product as appealing, and try to make what they do on TV as appealing as possible going forward. And if it doesn't change, then I think that story of TKO considering, removing Triple H or ousting him from creative, or ousting him from WWE entirely, I do think that's a very real possibility. Because what I do think is ultimately going to end up happening is, if there is not a significant change, if WWE does not make any major plans, or we continue to see a decline in terms of the interest, or the ticket sales, the ratings, like I mentioned the metrics before, if things continue to be on the decline going forward, then I think Triple H is ultimately going to be used as a scapegoat. Kind of like way back when Vince was, when Vince owned WWE, and some of you might remember the story. They brought in, Paul Heyman and Eric Bischoff to be the producers, or, the booker, or the producers or whatever for Raw and SmackDown respectively. And the shows still fucking sucked, like, months in. And Vince ultimately ended up firing both Bischoff and Heyman, and this was an actual story, and it's like, he basically, when, the shows didn't really change, or, they weren't really appealing in this, that, and the third, and what they were doing creatively didn't really stick, those guys ultimately took the blame, and they fucking got ousted, basically, from the company, or they got removed. And that was obviously, that was Vince being Vince. He wanted to basically put the blame on somebody else for, things not working out, or, plans not working out, or, the shows not being as interesting as, they should be. And he wanted to put the blame on somebody else instead of, putting the blame on himself, because, again, he was fucking in charge of everything. Even back then, he ran everything creatively. Like, he had his nose in everything WWE did on TV, He had the final say on everything. And if something wasn't working, or, plans weren't, working, or fans weren't getting invested, he would fucking point to somebody else and say, oh, this guy's the reason, and we need to get rid of him, or we're going to get rid of him. That's pretty much what I think might happen to Triple H if things don't change. And so, but yeah, again, I do think a lot of it is self-inflicted. I do think that Triple H, creatively, again, as a booker, maybe he's just run out of ideas. Maybe he's a slump. Maybe he's slumping. Maybe it's a matter of, his creativity isn't as good as it once was. It happens. Again, I think that's a fair assessment. And if you think about it, a lot of this is self-inflicted, and I do think that Triple H is the kind of person who, let's face facts, the dude's got an ego. You know, the dude's got an ego. I mentioned before him running NXT and making it the success that it was. You know, fans were really getting behind it, so on and so forth. And I think he saw that and he kind of was like, yeah, you know, this is my creation, blah, blah, blah. And I'm this, you know, big creative, you know, yeah, I'm such a creative genius and this, that, and the third. And he tried to incorporate that to the main roster and he did for a while. But it kind of, you know, plans kind of, you know, dipped, you know, things happen. And it's funny, you know, it's to me, it's just funny that Triple H was in charge of NXT and that whole thing, just based like just how NXT was run. Like, you know, it was run very much like an indie and so on and so forth. And that's, I think that's why fans gravitate to it because, you know, people are at the end of the day wrestling fans. And as much as, you know, WWE, you know, disdains the idea, people actually are into and like pro wrestling. Wrestling is actually a draw for people. People want to see pro wrestling. It has been for a long time, you know? And it's kind of funny how Triple H was behind the whole concept of NXT, just considering what kind of person he was, you know, just considering his overall viewpoints and his stance on, you know, things like wrestling outside of WWE, the indies, and how he views the IWC. I mean, this is the same man who a couple months ago even, you know, he was quoted as saying, I think a press conference or whatever, he basically told the fans of WWE, the people who were criticizing him or people who were complaining about, you know, the quality of the shows, he basically told people in so many words to STFU. And, oh, don't watch as a critic, watch as a fan. That's the kind of man that Triple H is. The man's got an ego. You know, he's got a massive ego. Okay, we've known this for many years. When he was a wrestler, he had a massive ego. You know, and he obviously had heavy say over what he did creatively in the company, like in terms of his character, in terms of him as a wrestler. And that resulted in, of course, the early 2000s, the reign of terror, as people call it, when he was the world heavyweight champion. He wrestle in high profile matches with the likes of The Rock and Stone Cold and The Undertaker and Kurt Angle and everybody else. And, you know, in certain circles, you know, a lot of people respect Triple H as a wrestler. They think he's a solid wrestler. And then in other circles, people think like the dude's an egomaniac. You know, he tries to make it all about him. You know, he's the guy who works with the guy. You know, he wants to get himself over more so than, you know, help other people get over. And, you know, it's just like, it's one of those things where like, it's clear, it's obvious, it's plain as day that the dude has an ego. You know, he sees the criticism. Like he sees the things people say about him in the IWC and it clearly gets to him, you know, that's why he reacted the way he did. But I think that ultimately a lot of everything that WWE, like everything they're experiencing, like the decline and the lack of interest, and you got talents who are reportedly unhappy within the company, unhappy with their creative direction, ultimately it falls on Triple H. It falls on Triple H there, where if there is a decline and there is an issue, it's up to him as the booker, as the head booker, as head of creative, to fix it and to steer the company in the right direction. And if they don't do that, then ultimately they're going to have to remove him. And I do think that that's a possibility. That's a real possibility. Why else would that report we heard a month or two ago be a thing? Where TKO was considering removing Triple H as head of creative in another year, you know, another year or another 18 months if things didn't change. And you could say, you know, oh, it's a thing where they're using him as a scapegoat, but it's kind of you know, the thing where if somebody's not doing the job, at some point they gotta be removed. Now the big question is, if they do remove Triple H as head of creative, who's going to come in after him? Who are they going to appoint as head of creative after that? That's what you got to ask yourself. And is the person who replaces Triple H, are they going to be any good? You got to ask yourself that question. Because if Triple H couldn't steer the ship, you know, or he had issues steering the ship now, what makes you think the next person who comes in is going to be any better? Like, just saying. What if it's fucking somebody like Bruce Pritchard? Jesus Christ. You know, and Bruce Pritchard's a name like, I mean, I don't even know if he's still part of them. I don't recall hearing them saying Bruce Pritchard was ever removed from WWE. Like, I know they say, obviously, you know, Vince, of course, Vince was ousted. You know, Kevin Dunn, he ended up leaving, or he was ousted too. John Laryngitis, of course, he was ousted. He's still part of that whole Janelle Grant thing. And a number of other people within Vince's circle were ultimately removed. Bruce Pritchard's name, one of those names that I don't really know if he's part of the company or not. So, God forbid if they put somebody like Bruce Pritchard as head of creative. Like, it's like, again, that's one of those things you got to think about. But yeah, so you can kind of see the writing on the wall with what WWE is becoming. They're becoming very profit based. They're becoming very money driven, corporate driven, a very corporately driven, money driven, profit driven company where they value the money they make and they value their sponsors and the shareholders over the wishes of the fans. And when you see things like that, that's a recipe for disaster. And you look at just kind of the decline in interest in things that are going on, and it's really reminiscent of how WWE was, before Vince got ousted. And it's one of those things where kind of in a bad spot, people can tout all they want about all the money, all the all-time high profits, and all the record gates, and they had a record high profits for WrestleMania, and that's why they're going back to the same spot for WrestleMania, Las Vegas, and oh my God, these record high numbers and this, that, and the third. They can tout all these things all day. It doesn't make a damn bit of difference if they're having a lack of interest in the decline, then they're having a lack of interest in the decline, and that's going to continue. It's going to continue, and it's going to continue to affect your on-screen product, and it's not going to get any better, and people are going to start to look at that, and they're going to start to tune out. And it's the same thing when Vince was there. They talk about all these all-time high profits, and folks, people don't give a shit. Like, unless you work for the company, or unless you're one of these sponsors or whatever, or you're one of these people, or unless you're getting money from them yourself, people don't care how much money they make. Like, as a fan, we don't care how much money they make. That's with any company. Like, as a fan, you want to see the best wrestling possible. You want to see the best show possible. You want to be entertained. You want to be the focal point of the show. You want people you want a wrestling show that appeals to you as a fan. You as a fan, and I'm speaking from experience, you value quality over everything else. And the quality just isn't there of WWE right now. In certain aspects, you could argue it is, but it's just like the decline in the quality is a serious problem. And until they address it, it's going to continue to be a problem. And is Triple H a part of that? I think partly yes, and I think partly no. And that's just my opinion. So that's pretty much my stance on it. Kind of me playing devil's advocate there. While, again, I do think he is responsible because he is head of creative. He is in charge. Everything they do creatively. And it falls on him to where if there is a decline and a lack of interest, it's up to him to make the changes necessary to make it interesting. Otherwise, he's not doing his job. Whereas at the same time, I do think that there is a bit of a power struggle, and there is, obvious influence from TKO and their parent company, and they're kind of the direction they're taking the company going forward. So it's kind of a lot of mixed things going on there. But I do think partly he is to blame and partly he is not to blame. So that's kind of my stance on that. I know that's kind of confusing, but that's pretty much my opinion on that. So anyway, that's pretty much all I got to say for that. So sorry if this was a lengthy video, but I had a lot to say, a lot to get out here. And this was a fairly big topic, so it warrants, having a long video. But anyway, that's all I got to say for this. So thank you for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed this little video here. If you did, be sure to hit that like button, leave a comment, give me your thoughts on anything I talked about here. What are your opinions? Do you think Triple H is responsible for the decline or whatever the case may be? Just hit me up, let me know in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Push it all Spark and get. With that being said, it's pretty much going to do it, man. So thank you for watching. More content to come for sure. But that's going to be it for me for now. So thank you for watching. Until next time, Wrestling Taco, I'm out. See you guys later. Peace.